We make a silent trade the moment we are born into a society. We surrender our primal right to exact personal revenge, and in exchange, the state promises to deliver impartial, measured justice. But a promise is only as good as its execution. When the state fails to protect the innocent, whether through apathy, corruption, or malice, that protective contract dissolves, leaving a dangerous vacuum. In that void, ordinary citizens step outside the boundaries of the legal system. They abandon the courts and resort to extreme, calculated violence to enforce their own moral codes. This breakdown doesn't happen the same way every time. Historically, vigilantism erupts from three distinct types of systemic failure: severe moral rot, absolute institutional corruption, and the failure of the courts to provide adequate retribution. Examining these three acts of extreme vigilante justice allows us to map the points where the legal code and the moral code diverge and see why that divergence so often ends in violence. In the 1850s, the United States legal system was operating exactly as designed. The problem was that the design explicitly protected and expanded the institution of slavery. The economy of the southern states relied on enslaved labor, and through compromises built into the Constitution, those states wielded the political power to ensure their wealth remained legally protected. This document is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It legally required citizens in northern, free states to actively capture and return escaped slaves to their owners. The law of the land officially criminalized basic human empathy. John Brown was a devout Calvinist who had spent his life helping enslaved people escape through the Underground Railroad. He believed in peaceful abolition until he witnessed a U.S. Marshal violently beat an enslaved boy over the head with an iron shovel. Seeing that physical horror up close stripped away his belief in pacifism. Brown realized that polite protests would never dismantle an entrenched economic machine. In 1856, after pro-slavery militias sacked an anti-slavery settlement in Kansas, Brown led a group of men into the night. They dragged pro-slavery settlers from their homes near Pottawatomie Creek and killed them with broadswords. 3 years later, Brown escalated his war. He and a small group of raiders seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, barricading themselves inside this very brick structure, now known as John Brown's Fort. His goal was to capture 100,000 federal rifles, distribute them to enslaved people, and ignite a violent uprising against slave owners. Brown's raid failed, and he was quickly executed for treason, but his vigilantism was born from a moral void. Because the legal system itself perpetuated a crime against humanity, participating peacefully within that system was structurally impossible. Around the exact same time, a completely different type of collapse was happening on the West Coast. The 1848 discovery of gold transformed San Francisco from a quiet port of 1,000 people into a chaotic boomtown of over 25,000 fortune seekers in just a couple of years. That rapid, unchecked growth outpaced the local government's ability to maintain order. Ruthless gangs, most notably a group of ex-convicts from Australia known as the Sydney Ducks, roamed the streets. They routinely set entire city blocks on fire to distract the tiny police force while they looted businesses. The citizens couldn't rely on the courts for protection because the institutions themselves were compromised. When criminals were actually arrested, they simply handed bribes to corrupt politicians and police officers and walked right out the front doors of the jail. The breaking point arrived when an anti-corruption newspaper publisher, James King, began exposing the criminal records of elected officials. In response, a corrupt city supervisor named James Casey confronted King, told him to draw, and fired a bullet straight into his chest. 2 days after King died from his wounds, 3,500 armed citizens formed the Committee of Vigilance. They bypassed the broken courts, marched on the jail, dragged James Casey and another protected murderer out of their cells, and hanged them both in front of the entire city. This uprising was a direct response to an institutional void. The citizens of San Francisco became the law because the men officially appointed to enforce it were indistinguishable from the criminals they were supposed to prosecute. Sometimes the state functions exactly as promised. In 1984, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the police successfully tracked down a 24-year-old karate instructor named Jeff Doucette, who had kidnapped and abused a 10-year-old boy named Jod. Doucette was arrested, held in custody, and prepared to stand trial. The legal system was moving efficiently. But for Jot's father, Gary Pochet, the reality of what his son endured was unbearable. He realized that a standard bureaucratic prison sentence would never adequately balance the scales for the destruction of his little boy's childhood. Hearing that Doucette was flying back to Baton Rouge to face charges, Gary disguised himself with a hat and sunglasses and walked into the airport. He stood quietly at a row of payphones in the main corridor, keeping his face turned away from the local news cameras gathered to film the suspect's arrival. As police escorted Doucette through the terminal, Gary calmly told the friend he had on the phone, "You're about to hear a shot." He dropped the receiver, pulled a revolver from his pocket, and fired a single point-blank round into Doucette's head on live television. Gary's violence highlights the retributive void. Even a perfectly functioning court system is clinical. It processes evidence and assigns prison terms, but it cannot satisfy a victim's primal demand for proportional retribution. This matrix outlines a fascinating inconsistency in how society treats extreme vigilante justice. If we map out the crimes and the subsequent punishments for these three vigilantes, the outcomes are radically different. Gary Pochet committed a premeditated assassination on live television. Yet he accepted a plea bargain for manslaughter and received only probation and community service, driven by overwhelming public sympathy for a grieving father. He never saw the inside of a prison. The San Francisco Committee of Vigilance executed 4 men and deported dozens without a trial. Their punishment was essentially a reward. They successfully pushed corrupt officials to resign, formed their own political party, and took complete control over the local government. John Brown, however, was swiftly convicted of treason and hanged, yet his violent raid on Harper's Ferry directly catalyzed the Civil War that began just over a year later, the very war that ultimately ended the institution he was fighting against. Society condemns vigilantism in theory because it invites chaos and undermines the fragile order of civilization, but in practice, we remain captivated by it. We are drawn to individuals who violently expose the flaws in our institutions when the official channels for reform have closed. These cases suggest that the law and justice are 2 entirely separate concepts. The law is a state mandate, justice is a moral demand. When they diverge far enough, citizens have shown they will spill blood to close the gap.